My first sexual education experience left a permanent memory in the moment I would fail to recognize as shameful, toxic, misleading, and degrading. As part of the exercise, the instructors handed each of us a piece of tape to stick on our arms. We were then instructed to go about the room and place the piece of tape on other people's arms. After we sat down, the instructors explained to us that putting the tape on each other's arms was an analogy to having sex with each person. They noted that each time we had sex with the person, the tape became less sticky and was harder to make a connection with. They said that this is like having sex before marriage, and that each time you have sex, it makes it harder to have a special connection with other people. This story, one that many others have heard or experienced, is just a glimpse into the teaching of abstinence-only sex education, the primary form of sex education in the United States. As I stated in my audience analysis, this form of sex ed has affected us all, as most college students receive similar messages in their middle and high school health classes, with about 1 unit dedicated to sex education. The lack of true information given in the lessons has left many of us unsure of the safe sex methods for those who decide to have sex before marriage. It leaves some feeling like they have something to be ashamed of, or are somehow less worthy of others because of the personal choices they have a right to make. The sexual orientation and gender identity of others is left completely out of the conversation, and they have nowhere to look for guidance. Adults then have teens who have never received the sex education they expected the school to provide. As mentioned above, I have personally experienced this form of sex education and have been left scrambling for information I should have received in the class dedicated to informing me on healthy sex practices, as well as relationships. Throughout this speech, I will provide information on the problems and ineffectiveness of abstinence-only sex education, what causes those problems, and how to solve them. First, let's start with the ineffectiveness of abstinence-only sex education and the many problems it creates. While abstinence-only sex ed has a range of definitions, it usually follows strict patterns about what should and shouldn't be taught in schools, as explained by Becca Andrews. 1. It teaches that abstinence from sex outside of marriage is the only completely effective way to avoid unwanted pregnancy and the spread of STIs. 2. Teaches that sex outside of marriage often leads to harmful physical and psychological side effects. And 3. Focuses on the idea that there are many gains to avoiding premarital sex, whether they be social, psychological, or health related. It's important to know that abstinence-only sex education actually tends to lead to higher rates of teen pregnancies and higher rates of birth. According to a study completed by Catherine Stranger Hall and David Hall, the level of abstinence-only sex ed within the states included in the study were positively correlated with teen pregnancy and higher birth rates. This implies that the abstinence message being preached is not resonating with teens. The entire point of abstinence-only sex education is to prevent teens from engaging in sexual behaviors, most importantly sex, before marriage, or to delay sex for as long as possible. If levels of teen pregnancy do not go down as abstinence-only sex education goes up, it is clearly not doing its job of preventing teens from having sex. Abstinence-only sex education pushes the message that all sex outside of marriage is harmful, and often forces shame upon those who have had sexual relationships before. A quote from Becca Andrews from Mother Jones illustrates the experience from a young woman's point of view after receiving abstinence-only sex education in high school. I couldn't figure out what I liked because I grew up hearing that I wasn't supposed to like any of it. I felt paralyzing shame out of a basic expression of love. This was years after she had graduated from high school and had entered a long-term relationship. The curriculum of abstinence-only sex education focuses on the ideal of heterosexual relationships and sex, but only within marriage, and leaves the LGBTQ+ students out of the picture. In the Glensill 2013 National School Climate Survey from the article of the Human Rights Campaign found that less than 5% of LGBTQ+ students had sex ed classes that showed positive representations of LGBTQ+ related topics. Now that I have explained the problems associated with abstinence-only sex education, let's move to the causes. In the article by Becca Andrew, Kevin Riley, a school superintendent, agrees that doing anything but abstinence-only sex education would send out mixed signals. He compares comprehensive sex ed to telling students that that since they're going to drink, they might as well get a DD, or since they're going to be doing drugs, they should at least be safe. This mindset, along with underlying religious views, is what has contributed to the widespread use of abstinence-only sex education in the U.S. People believe that by giving information about contraceptives and safe sex practices, that they are actively encouraging students to engage in sexual acts. Based off the study previously mentioned, abstinence-only sex education tend to be positively correlated to higher rates of teen pregnancy and birth rates in states where it is widely used. Because the students in these states are only receiving one message, don't have premarital sex, they are not receiving other information on how to prevent pregnancy or the spread of STIs. Without this important information and ignoring the message of abstinence only, they are participating in sexual activities with less protection than those who undergo comprehensive sex education. This is comparable to telling people to avoid driving because it is the only way to avoid being in an accident. Instead of telling them not to drive, you should give them tips on wearing seatbelts or going the speed limit and abiding by the laws. Similarly, you should give people advice on how to practice safe sex methods. The curriculum of abstinence-only sex education focuses on encouraging students to wait until marriage to have sex, and usually only includes examples of heterosexual relationships. LGBTQ+ students are therefore completely left out of the lessons and learn nothing about their options for safe sex practices, or even healthy relationships for same-sex couples. According to the Human Rights Campaign, the lack of representation in abstinence-only sex education often leads to LGBTQ+ students looking to online resources or peers, which can often be inaccurate and harmful. After looking at the problems and causes of abstinence-only sex education, we can move on to the solutions. The alternative to abstinence-only sex education is called comprehensive sex education. It includes abstinence as an option, but also includes information on other forms of contraception, safe sex practices, informed decision-making, etc. This method recognizes that some teens are going to make the choice to have sex, and instead of shaming them, it gives them tools to be safe. With more informed decision-making and resources that allow for more prevention, teens will be able to decrease rates of teen pregnancy and birth rates. Having a more inclusive sex education is an important step that will allow all LGBTQ+ students to feel included and allow them to make more informed decisions. This type of discussion in sex ed is actually supported by the majority of parents, according to the Human Rights Campaign. Changing curriculum to be more inclusive would only be exactly what most people already expect out of our sex education. Reaching out to schools, school boards, and even local representatives about comprehensive sex education often gives enough push to enact more reasonable sex education lessons and could mean a positive change for your education systems and future students. Working to inform teens close to you can also help to protect and educate them on healthy sex practices. After reviewing all of this evidence, it is clear that abstinence-only sex education is ineffective and problematic in many ways. Throughout this speech, I have discussed the problems with abstinence-only sex education, what causes these problems, and how to solve them. I encourage all of you to reflect on how abstinence-only sex education has formed the way you viewed sex and how it will continue to affect the way in which adolescents view and participate in sexual behaviors. Looking back on my own sex education experience, I hope others who experience similar lessons were able to recognize how misinformed and harmful such curriculum was when it came to forming their views on sex and sex education.